I am so excited about tonight's guest, Chris Putnam. Chris is a best-selling author and co-author with Thomas Horn of Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, and Exo Vaticana, Vatican's astonishing exo-theological plan for the arrival of an alien savior. He holds a master's degree in theological studies and a bachelor's of science degree in mathematics and religion, as well as a certification in Christian apologetics. He has appeared on numerous television programs, including the History Channel, Countdown to Apocalypse, and many other documentary films. Chris is recognized for his expertise in the area of technology, the occult, Bible prophecy, and many other prophetic traditions. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, Aaron, it's great to be on the show with you.
I am really excited, Chris, because I've seen you. I've seen you talk on other programs about this work, and when I first heard of your book, basically your two books, Exo Vaticana, and then the Petrus Romanus. Listen, I was blown away because this is things that you hear about. You know, you get bits and pieces, this stuff. And when you're on, the front lines like we are, you tend to be more aware of these things. But when you put it all together in this book, Exo Vaticana, it was astonishing. It really was. And I have to tell you, that is not just coming from me, but that's coming from others within my circle that has highly suggested getting these two books. And when I first learned about it, I said, I got to have Chris on because this is the cutting edge. This is where it all comes together, and you put it really, I think, succinctly in these two books. But when I was going through your book, I wrote a book called Alien Agenda: The Return of the Nephilim, and we are on the same page a lot of this stuff. And I realize that a lot of researchers that are independently researching this topic are also coming to the same conclusions. And I have to say that you nailed it in this. And what grabbed your interest, Chris, in just before writing the book, but when you're just when you first learned of this subject, what grabbed your attention and said, "Hey, I need to check into this"?
Are you talking about Exo Vaticana?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Tom and I had written Petrus Romanus, and it kind of took off. It actually, some of the things that we predicted in that book came to pass in a way that we never would have anticipated, and so that book got a lot of national attention, and that's what got me on the History Channel and all this other stuff. But I've always kind of been into UFOs, and in fact, before I was a Christian, I had studied the subject as a little kid even, and I have a whole notebook full of newspaper articles I collected probably around age 7, 8, 9. I was cutting out newspaper articles about UFOs, and of course, at that age, and not really being in the church, I kind of thought they were really aliens, and after becoming a Christian and stuff, I had sort of been introduced to L.A. Marzulli's fiction book called Nephilim. And so I sort of found out about him and Guy Malone and Mike Heiser and that crowd that did the original Ancient of Days conference. And so I learned, that perspective from those guys in the early 2000s. So, I had that kind of background. But, we had just written this massive book about the Catholic Church, and really my hypothesis with the Malachi prophecy and Petrus Romanus is that it seems very likely, if that prophecy works out to really be a true prophecy, and there's some reasons to suspect it might, that we thought that the final pope would be one and the same as the biblical false prophet. And that being the case, a lot of people started asking us, well, what do you guys make of all these things that the Catholic Church has been saying about ETs and UFOs and aliens? And, I was aware that they had been saying these things. So it was kind of a natural transition because that's a subject that Tom Horn has fielded quite a bit in the past as well. So it was kind of a really a natural transition from Petrus Romanus for us to start digging into that subject. So that's really what inspired the book.
Right. Now, Chris, let me back up to Petrus Romanus because you and Tom made a prediction that this Catholic Pope would would be or is or maybe the final Pope. Is that correct? Is that your prediction?
Well, no, that's the prediction of Malachi Morgare, a an Irish saint who lived in the 12th century. He gave this prophecy of the popes, which was a list, of 112, and just so happens that we are living in the time of the 112th, who is Pope Francis, is the last one on the list.
Really,
Now,
this current Pope?
this current pope is the last one, and it's this has been going on since 1132 AD. That's when it started, and so we've gone in this sequence of 112 popes that were all prophesied, and many of the predictions in the Malachi prophecy have been astonishingly accurate. Like one of the ones that really caught my attention. There was one. Most of them are these little short Latin phrases, okay, and they either describe something about the pope or where he's from or his coat of arms or perhaps events that happen while he's in office. So it's a little vague. I think there's some valid criticism there, but some of them are just astonishingly precise, and it seems to belie coincidence. For instance, there was one, it's a Latin phrase, religio depopulata, which means religion depopulated. It's for a really wooden translation. And along the sequence of the prophecy, this actually fell during the pontificate that was right at the turn of the 20th century. And, it amazingly was right at the time that World War I broke out. It's at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, where historians think maybe 200 million people left the church because of communism, because of the rise of the Communist Party. And Lenin wrote specifically about targeting religious leaders. More than any time in history, you probably see religion depopulated. You have the First World War, you have, the Communist Revolution and the rise of militant atheism. That kind of prediction that's a falsifiable claim. That you wouldn't expect that to happen. You wouldn't expect religion to be depopulated. And right when this prophecy predicts it, we had the most massive depopulation of religion in history. That one really made me take notice. Now, not all of them are that good. That's probably the best one. But
Right.
there's several that are pretty compelling, and they seem to get more compelling the more recent you get. Like with Pope, the Pope that everybody remembers, John Paul II.
Sure.
His was from the labor of the sun, or the labor solis in Latin, and it turns out he was born during a solar eclipse. And then when he died, the day he was buried, it turned out to be a solar eclipse as well. Now, that seems to fit from the labor of the sun fairly well. And it's one of those things you're like, I don't know, but man, that's pretty uncanny. So you have ones like that. And then there's other ones, it almost seems like the Pope would go out of his way to make it be fulfilled. Pius II, Pius XII, he was the Pope during World War II. He his motto, his Malachi prediction was angelic shepherd. Okay. Now that's pretty vague. How would you ever know if that was matched or not? You wouldn't, there's really no way to say that's fulfilled, hardly. But you know what he did? Right during the middle of all the controversy of World War II, with the Vatican kind of being a little too quiet about Hitler up there, a lot of people were accusing him of, he produced kind of a propaganda film about what a great pope he was. And guess what he named it?
What?
Angelic Shepherd. And
No kidding. No
yeah,
kidding.
he claimed it. He just went out of his way, produced a documentary about himself and titled it with his Malachi motto. So,
Oh, that's weird.
yeah, it is weird. So, like, you have the splash screen at the beginning of the film, and it has the Malachi motto right there. It's like a day in the life of Saint Malachi's angelic shepherd, and that's like the subheading for the film. And so he literally, made it happen. You could probably say the same for the Pope, or just before Francis, for Pope Benedict, because the motto for him was "Glory of the Olive." Okay, and for that reason, a lot of the Catholics who kind of speculate who's going to win the papacy, they bet on it. They even have bookies and stuff that run odds on this stuff, and they were all kind of had their money on it being a a Benedictine, which is a monastic order within Catholicism, because the symbol for the Benedictines is the olive branch. So the glory of the olive, he would be the glory of the Olivetans, who is a branch of the Benedictines. So they suspected it would be an Olivetan Benedictine monk or somebody from that tradition. Well, when Cardinal Ratzinger got the papacy, it kind of threw him off because he was not a Benedictine. But the deal is, the popes get to pick their papal name. Now, he was Joseph Ratzinger, and what does he pick? Benedict. So he made it match. And, so it almost works out to be a self-fulfilling kind of thing, but it's still fulfilled, And so some of these ones, like religion depopulated, nobody could manipulate that, I don't think. So you can't say they're all like that, but it seems like the ones that aren't, like they go out of their way to make it happen. So it almost seems like it's some kind of providence involved. So for that reason, I don't dismiss it. I'm not saying that this prophecy is on the level of a biblical prophecy. I don't believe that, but it is really interesting, and it has so many compelling fulfillments. I don't think we can just brush it aside. So anyway, here we are at the final one on the list, and it's not a short little phrase. It's actually a paragraph. It says, "In the extreme persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman," that's Petrus Romanus in Latin, "who will nourish the sheep in many tribulations. And when they are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people." So that's the prediction for the Pope that's in office right now. And that sounds a lot like Revelation chapter 17, which also has the judgment of a 7-hilled city who had dominion over the kings of the earth. If you look at Revelation 17, it talks about the woman that you saw, sitteth on 7 hills. That's in there. And then at the end of the chapter, the last line is, "That woman that you saw is that great city who has dominion over the kings of the earth." Now, when John wrote the book of Revelation, we're talking around 90-something AD. We're at the peak of the Roman Empire. There was really no other candidate for a city that had dominion over the kings of the earth other than Rome. So, I mean, it's clear to me that his intention was for his readers to understand that great harlot, Mystery Babylon, in that context, when he sent that letter, he meant Rome. Now, has that turned into some typology that includes more than that now? That's possible. I'm not really going to argue that point, but I think in the original context, it certainly meant Rome, and it really matches this final prophecy of this papal prophecy really well. It talks about a 7-hilled city being judged. So that's where we're at with it. And, if you look at the kind of things that Pope Francis is doing, he's been out saying that atheists can please God just if they obey their conscience. He's making statements like that. When he was confronted about homosexual priests, his answer was, "Who am I to judge?" He's really got that preaching to the itching ears of the world. He really has that kind of postmodern, real flexible definition of truth going on, it seems like to me. And he's really preaching to those itching ears. So he fits the model of what I would expect of, if you look at Revelation chapter 13, it talks about a second beast that rises, and it says that he has horns like a lamb, yet speaks like a dragon. Now, when I think of those apocalyptic language and the symbols, horns are typically a symbol for power.
Sure.
Now, like a lamb, I think that's really transparently saying that this person is seen as a Christian. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. I mean, in biblical symbolism, lamb is pretty good symbol for Christ, or for the Messiah. So you have someone who's powerful like a lamb, yet speaks like a dragon. Wow. Now, you see where I'm going? It really does seem to match, a corrupt pope very well.
Well, and even the Catholics are, my understanding is they were saying that, we're coming towards the end of one of the last popes. And I've been hearing that for the last few years. But is it true that the current pope, they all have a right-hand man? They have someone who's their go-to guy, their right-hand man. And I guess that's true with the Pope and all the previous popes. But what is this guy's name? Do you know his name?
I'm not sure. He just got a new guy, and I don't have his name on the tip of my tongue. He did have, one of our favorites actually to win the papacy, didn't win, and he just got rid of him. And now, yeah, I don't know who the number two guy is right now, to be honest with you.
Well, I had heard that his name was Petrus Romanus, and I didn't know if that was true.
Not directly. I mean, he's got a Peter in his name. I've heard
Yeah.
that too. I heard
Yeah.
that too. But I've never said and never really thought that that's a literal name because it doesn't really make any sense. The prophecy itself, if we look at, the ones that I've told you about, none of them gave a literal name for any of the popes. It was usually
Okay.
some kind of symbolic thing.
Okay.
Now, if you think about the central claim of the papacy to power is apostolic succession from the apostle Peter. So they use the name that it's the seat of Peter. They even call it like the Petrine office. They turn it into an adjective, Peter, I-N-E, Petrine. It's the Petrine office. So, I don't even think that any pope would ever take the name Peter because it would be almost like a blasphemy or something to that
Yeah.
whole thing, So
Yeah.
to me, I think all popes are claiming to be Peter in a way. It's like the next Peter in line. So I see that as a real, it's pretty much a metaphor, and they're all pretty much Romans in the sense that they're the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, And here we have Pope Francis just this week is reinstating, I think, Latin for the Mass, which a lot of people have been complaining about. A lot of the traditionalist Catholics were mad when they switched it to, the vernacular language of the country so that people could understand it. But now I think he's reinstating it back to the old Latin. And I don't know what's up with that, but
Wow.
it kind of fits the Roman thing pretty well.
Sure. Sure.
But he's
Well,
actually okay. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say. I mean, this was all addressed in Petrus Romanus, which was the first book. The final pope is here, and so this was all grabbing your attention, and you said this couldn't be ignored, and you begin to realize that, not only was there this prophecy that there would be a final pope, but there was also this link between the Catholic Church and the UFO phenomenon, and then that research led into the book Exo Vaticana,
That's right.
which was the plan for the arrival of an alien savior. Now, when I heard this, I thought, okay, I've heard it all, because here we have a religious institution endorsing an alien savior, and what in the world is all that about?
Well, it's really interesting. A lot of people don't know, but the Vatican maintains a state-of-the-art astronomical facility on Mount Graham in Arizona, United States. It's called the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, and they are on the forefront of astronomy. And up at that facility, actually right next to it, is the most powerful telescope in the world, and it's called the Large Binocular Telescope. And so they have a whole host of astronomers known as the Vatican Observatory Research Group, and the acronym is VORG, which kind of makes for some interesting little snipes about the Borg and Star Trek and things like that. Had a little
Oh,
fun
it's the
with that.
Vorg,
It's Borg with a V,
as in
yeah.
victory.
Yeah,
Vorg.
but you can it sort of sounds like Borg, so you will be
Yeah.
assimilated either way.
You will be assimilated.
But so
What are
they
those
have,
guys up to?
they are deeply involved in work in the science of astrobiology, which is the search for life in space. Now, it's not just that. If you've been in the UFO game for a little while, you're probably aware of Corrado Balducci. Now, he's a Jesuit. He's not a Jesuit. He's a demonologist. He's got the
Okay.
title Monsignor, and that's an honorary title that has to be given to you by a pope. Now, I think it was in the 90s. Corrado Balducci came on Italian television, and this is on YouTube, and you can find the video. But he went on and said, just point blank, that without a doubt, the information that he had that extraterrestrials were real. They were biological beings. They were tangible beings. They were not demons. That they existed, and there was no doubt about it. I mean, just point blank said that. Now we have that transcribed from the original Italian. He was speaking Italian in the video, but there's a video on YouTube. You can find it. Balducci. Just if you just Google it, you'll find the video. But and it makes you wonder, what kind of inside information does he have that he can say something, be that sure of himself and be that absolute about it. Now, he's been in a number of the UFO documentaries. I think he was on Fast Walkers in that video. That's kind of he was in Greer's last one that just came out. They had a little snippet of him, and he was saying that they will be greatly superior to us. He just, kind of had him. He was speaking Italian. And so here we have a top-level demonologist, close friend of John Paul II, high-ranking, lives in Rome. He was the demonologist for the Diocese of Rome and the exorcist. Going on public, saying that ETs are certainly real and that we can't doubt it. And he would speak at UFO conventions. And, to the kind of crowd that you sort of expect at those things, it's, mostly like New Agers and, people that are a little bit off the beaten path. And he would get up there and address them as his people and say, I really want to be the liaison between the star peoples and the Holy Roman Church. And I want to bring, and this was his goal. He went around and, the whole UFO circuit. And he did this all through the late 90s into the early 2000s. And I believe he died in 2007, so he's no longer with us. But, he was really very sure of himself. And it just had a lot of people in the UFO community thinking that the Vatican really did know something, because he was not tentative at all in the sort of language that he used. And the thing that disturbs me the most about him, though, here we have a guy that's supposed to be an expert in demonology and, demon possession. He's an exorcist, making absolute statements that these ETs are not evil. Now, when I have studied the abduction phenomenon, I've read John Mack's books. I've read David Jacobs' books. I've read the different sides of the story. Yeah. I'm familiar with some of the debate. Some of Guy Malone's camp would say that they're probably mostly spiritual beings. Other people on the other side are saying that they're more physical beings, and there's a lot of disagreement about that. I think it's some of both myself, and I don't think either side has the complete truth on that. I think it's something that, a lot of the language that people like Jacques Vallée and J. Allen Hynek would use, they would call it paraphysical. It's some of both. I mean, and this is conclusions that even the secular researchers are realizing. It's something that we don't really quite understand. And so, when we start fighting each other over it, we're probably not doing ourselves any favors.
I mean, I like what you said, though, that both sides, from their perspective may have a little bit of the truth on this thing.
I think they do. Yeah.
But others would say that that their descriptions of these things are malevolent.
Well, yeah, that's where I was going to. Is that no matter whether it's physical or not, when you read the stories from the abductees, they're evil. There's just no doubt about it. They're
right.
They're invading people's lives against their will. They're basically torturing them, and they ruin people's lives.
Incredible.
And people. Some of the people, they get that syndrome where they start to like their captor, I think, and they start to like it. Like you can read. The communion author, what's his name? It's escaping me right now. The guy that wrote Communion.
Oh, I'll get it here in a second.
Yeah, me too. I'm blanking out on it right now.
Yeah, it'll come to my mind here in a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you read his early books, and there were times where he would write that they were demons, and he didn't doubt it. I mean, he literally said that, right? And then now, if you listen to him, he says that he thinks that they're here to help him with his spiritual evolution. It's Whitley Strieber. That's his name.
Oh, Whitley Strieber. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you're
So
right.
yeah, Whitley, some of his early books, he was absolutely convinced that these were demons, just
You're right.
tormenting him. And he actually
You're right.
came out and said that specifically, even used the word demon.
Yeah.
And but then lately that now they're here to help us with their cosmic consciousness, and it's all some kind of shamanic, ritual to help us transition into a higher state of evolution or something. And but he's gone through so much. It's like I think it just becomes a coping mechanism for a secular person to just sort of accept it and try to grow through it. And but I don't think it changes the early conclusions. I think he was right at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I do too. Well, in my research, I came across Whitley's work, and I cite him in my book, Alien Agenda: The Return of the Nephilim, and I cite some of those sources that Whitley was talking about there. That his own descriptions of them were malevolent and
Yeah,
evil in nature,
no
and
doubt.
and I think you're right. I think he nailed it on the first time. Listen, Chris, we're going to come up on a break here. People who have experienced these things. But take us back to 1917, Chris, and this Fatima miracle of the sun. What do you think that was a UFO?
Yeah, I really do. And I think there's some really solid reasons to come to that conclusion. So, first off, we have to acknowledge, what does the term UFO mean? It means unidentified flying object. So by definition, we're dealing with something that's unidentified. Now that makes the whole subject murky, because when someone says UFO, we're not always talking about the same sorts of things. That term probably covers a whole range of stuff, from
Okay.
misidentified weather balloons to top secret military aircraft to really strange things that we don't know what they are. And now those are the ones that I'm interested in. And if you listen to any of the ufologists and the scholars that follow this, they all will say that the vast majority of reported UFOs, probably 95%, turn out to be identified somehow. But there's a stubborn 10 to 5% that never are, and they kind of defy explanation. Those are the really interesting ones. Now, I think the Fatima sighting would be one of those for several reasons. This has happened in October 13th, 1917. So we're talking about before planes were flying in the sky, okay?
Right.
And what the people, this is what they call one of those Marian apparitions, okay, which is supposed to be an appearance of the Virgin Mary, where she delivered these fantastic Fatima prophecies that the Catholic Church holds in such regard, that the popes even hold in great regard. Some of them thought that one of them predicted that Pope John Paul II would be shot. But a lot of people think that the Catholic Church is actually covering up the third secret of Fatima, and there's a lot of controversy about that. A lot of them think that Pope Benedict actually issued a false prophecy to cover up the real one. So there's all this controversy about these prophecies. But, the thing to me, number one, I'm a Protestant, I'm a Baptist. I don't buy into the Virgin Mary appearing to people and giving them prophecies. I don't think the Marian apparition has anything to do with the mother of Jesus. I really think that this is a deceptive entity as well. I think it leads people away from worshiping God. I think it's idolatry. I think that Catholics are led to pray to a dead human. Okay, no matter what Mary was, she was a human being. She was a sinner just like you and me. And she was chosen for an awesome task, to give birth to our Savior and Lord, but she was just a person, okay? She was not God. She does not hear the simultaneous prayers of millions of people. That is a divine attribute. That is not something that a human woman could do, even if she's deceased. So I don't buy into it. I think the theology is very much twisted. So that's a very Protestant view on Mary. But so coming from that, I'm looking at what is going on with these apparition things. What happened in Fatima? Because at Fatima, up to 70,000 people stood in a field and saw this. Okay, what they saw has nothing to do with Mary. This is all just something that the Catholics sort of attached to it. It doesn't have any connection to Mary whatsoever.
They're trying to identify it, but they don't know what this thing is.
The only thing that hooks it to Mary is that three small children, we're talking about ages 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. There was three of them. And they were staying in it. They were the ones that heard the voice that told everybody to come to the field. And they kind of go into a trance. And one of them starts scribbling down messages for Mary. Okay. And it's very much just like the same sort of thing that you see the channelers do. You know, the people that are in the New Age and they go into a trance and they channel some entity. It's the
Sure.
same thing. It's the exact same phenomenon. In fact, there's a sociologist who wrote a paper, and I cite it in the book, where she compared New Age channeling to the Marian phenomenon and said it's identical. There's really nothing different about it. So anyway, that's really the only connection to Mary. So what is it that made 70,000 people stand out in the rain in a field in 1917 to look up at the sky? Well, they call it the miracle of the sun. And, you know, and the way the legend goes, the sun danced around in the sky. Now, I've got a video on YouTube and several places talking about why this is not the sun. Number one, if it was the sun, it would not be limited to a field in Fatima, Portugal. The whole world would have seen it. Okay, if the sun moved around in the sky, it would have actually, the gravitational forces would have yanked the Earth all around the solar system and probably killed everybody on the planet.
Yeah.
So the sun did not really move. That's just, you know, the laws of physics, it literally would destroy the Earth for that to happen. But, you know, even if it was perceived as the sun moving, it really couldn't have been the sun because, like I said, it wouldn't be limited to this small area. So what did happen? Well, I'm going to read a testimony from a person who was there. And this is in one of Jacques Vallée's books. It says, "The sun appeared as a disk of brilliant silver." This is a quote. "A weird disk that turns rapidly on its own axis and casts off beams of colored lights in all directions. Shafts of red light shot out from the rim of the sun and colored the clouds, the earth, the trees, the people. Then shafts of violet, of blue, of yellow, and of other colors followed in succession." So, you know, here you have someone in 1917 talking about a weird disk spinning on its axis, shooting out colors, you know, that's...
Yeah, that don't sound like the sun.
It doesn't sound like the sun at all. And, you know, they even said a disk of brilliant silver. So, you know, after a while, it stopped spinning, quote, "plunged downward in a zigzag fashion toward the earth and horrified the spectators," end quote. So this is a, you know, saying this thing is flying around, zigzagging in the sky. It's a silver disk. That sounds like a flying saucer, you know. Sure. It really does. Wow. And that, you know, that word was not in the vocabulary in 1917. That really did not come into our vocabulary until 1948, 49, right in there. So here we are, you know, just sort of anticipating what started happening in the 40s. And, you know, and so this has been declared a genuine miracle by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, they officially recognize this.
Yes, they do.
Okay, now let's fast forward to the 1950s.
Okay.
And Pope Pius XII saw something very similar over Rome. Is it directly linked, indirectly linked to this thing that happened in 1970 at the Fatima miracle?
Well, here I have a quote from Pope Pius XII, October 30 and 31st, right on Halloween, 1950. Here's the quote. I'm going to read it. "The opaque sphere moved outward slightly, either spinning or moving from left to right, and vice versa. But within the sphere, you could see marked movements with total clarity and without interruption." So this is his description. And then he says it, you know, a silvery disc that flew in the sky. It shot out colors. This is over the Vatican gardens in Rome. Now, what makes this really interesting is the timing. So here we are, you know, from 1917 all the way up to 1950. You know, this is quite a bit later. It's in a different location. It's over Italy.
Right.
And really the only person I know that claims to have seen it was Pope Pius XII. Now, he said it was over the Vatican gardens. This is 33 years later, right? And but it's the timing of it. Because what he was doing, he was, you know, have you ever heard of the Catholic doctrine of the Assumption of Mary? This is the idea that Mary ascended into heaven, just like Jesus is described to do at the end of Luke's gospel, at the beginning of the book of Acts. You know, Jesus ascends into heaven, and the apostles all stand there looking up, and the angels say, well, he's going to come back the same way you saw him leave, you know, to the Mount of Olives. But The Catholics, this is a kind of a something that goes back to maybe the third century AD. So it really wasn't believed by any of the really early church, but you start seeing some of those apocryphal gospels that talk about this idea that Mary ascended. And some of them say that she died and then her body ascended. Others say that she ascended alive like Jesus did. So it's never even really been a coherently clear accounting of it. So that you can trace it back to some of these apocryphal gospels in the third, fourth century, but nobody in the church ever really bought into it. And so in Catholicism, various people believed it. And a lot of important people did, but not everybody did. And it was never really made a dogma that you had to believe because it was so speculative and its historical foundation is very flimsy. Like I said, you don't really even see it written down until the third or fourth century. I mean, I'm talking about, 400 AD, 300, somewhere in there.
Okay.
So, 300 years after Jesus. But there's been like this steady group of true believers, all these people that are really into Mary. They say that she's sinless, that they believe that she was born without original sin. And this whole thing about Mary, it kind of evolved. I mean, nobody in the early church prayed to Mary. Nobody. You don't find anybody like Justin Martyr or any of those guys, any of those church fathers writing about praying to Mary. That never happened. This stuff kind of all evolved. It's all a tradition, and it's all, you can just look at how they grew this legend. And it has no historical foundation. And that's another reason I don't think anybody should be praying to Mary or believing in it. It's really based on mostly fiction. But you look at this, in 1950, Pope Pius XII wrote up a dogma, where everyone has to believe in the Assumption of Mary. It's going to be an official Catholic doctrine.
Now, wait a minute. Did he tie this into the siding
Well, here you go.
over Rome?
So he had it written up, and he was thinking about promulgating it, and he wasn't sure. Should I do this? It's controversial. I don't know if I should do it. He's kind of on the fence. Then he has this sighting, and he takes that, oh, well, this is exactly what happened in Fatima. It's the Virgin Mary telling me I should do it.
Wow.
And that's literally why all Catholics are required to believe in the Assumption of Mary now. It's because he saw a UFO.
So he does tie this event.
Oh, it's absolutely that's
Rome.
that's what inspired it. And he wrote a handwritten note, and they have it. You can look it up online and find the note even. That is why he did it. That's what inspired him to go ahead and push it through. And so literally we have a UFO dictating official church doctrine.
Well, this is interesting, Chris, because in the 40s we see on the the thing in Roswell that gets everyone's interest. Of course, the military denies it, but look, there's this whole push from the late 40s onward in the culture of America and really the culture of the world, because different cultures are experiencing these things, as we just talked about, that there is a paradigm shift into the belief of UFOs and maybe life existing on other planets. Now we get in the 1950s, the Catholic Church coming out in an official position, religiously supporting the idea of UFOs. And so we have two fronts coming together, one on a social front, and then in a cultural front, and the other one from a religious front, and they're all meeting and converging and saying the same thing, that we're not alone. And to me, I find that staggering, because now we have the Catholic Church advocating this. I was reading a chapter in your book, and you talked about one of the abductees being interviewed by Richard Dolan, and he said that there was a synchronicity that they use as a language to communicate, and how they use the numbers 333, which would be half of 666 as the mark of the beast that we would all think of. But there was a strange synchronicity manifesting. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is this true? Are they synchronizing the message and using these different ways to communicate?
Well, I'll tell you, when you start digging into this stuff and you're coming at it from the angle that Tom Horn and myself are, and I suppose you too in LA, and there's a crowd of us who really do associate these UFOs and these entities with demons and with fallen angels. So we're looking into the occult is what we're doing. Let's just face it. This is an occult subject when we're coming at it from the angle we are. One of the things that I did, I did some exegesis on Paul talking about Satan as the prince of the power of the air, and the biblical worldview was that the demons inhabit the sky between the earth and the moon. Okay. So
Yeah.
it's not terribly surprising that people see weird things in the sky that leads them to some kind of new age pantheistic worldview. It shouldn't be that shocking. So when you're asking me about this language of synchronicity, well, this comes from Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung was really the father of analytic psychology, I think they call it. And he embraced an occult worldview. He's known, as a psychologist and a scientist, but he really was an occultist in a lot of ways. And you can learn a lot from him, but you have to be careful. You don't really want to buy into his belief system. But a lot of what he says is true in a sense, but it's not the kind of truth you want to embrace and live by. But there's some reality to it. But it's kind of the way occult things work. Now, he has a theory of archetypes, these kind of symbols that speak into the human consciousness. And, there's some truth in that. And advertisers will capitalize on that kind of stuff. And a lot of this is how, these magicians work and how people like Aleister Crowley, it's all trading on these occultic ideas. So you want to be really careful when you're looking into this. But so Carl Jung wrote a book on flying saucers in the 1950s. And I read that book as part of my research, just trying to get a grasp on how, these people see this phenomenon. And Carl Jung really did predict the arrival of an alien savior in that book. He even wrote about it specifically, how people had lost hope in Christianity. And he's in Europe in the 60s. And this is about the time that the church was really just being abandoned left and right. It actually had started earlier than that, but Europe's probably 30 years ahead of us. And, you see where we are now. We're probably, a little bit further along than what he saw in the 60s in Europe, where people were apostatizing and pretty much buying into a pantheistic, monistic worldview, kind of an Eastern thing. This is what most people believe nowadays, that all religions lead to God and all is one. And, if you're just a good person, you'll go to heaven.
Yeah.
All these kind of things.
We hear Oprah Winfrey
say
that quite a bit.
She's the champion of it. And that's the dominant worldview in the United States now. That's the dominant religious idea in the United States. I would call it oneism. All is one and everything will work out. Of course, I don't believe that. But Carl Jung was very much on that page. And, I don't want to get too deep into Jung. I want to get back to your question. You're talking about synchronicities. Well, what is a synchronicity? Well, it's kind of a happy coincidence. And I think we all experience them. And so, he's not completely out in left field, but I don't think his reasoning is completely sound. But, like you think of your friend and then they call you like 30 seconds later. So I think all of us have it. These coincidences seem to have meaning. Now, when these happen to Christians, we use language like, God's opening doors, to show me that this is his will, or well, I'm going to pray about it. And, if the door's open, then I'm going to do it. You know what I'm saying? We use that kind of language. Like if if this is his will, then, he'll make these synchronicities happen.
I call it Christianese.
Right. But it's the same sort of thing that these people with an occult worldview would call it a synchronicity. They wouldn't say, well, God's opening the doors, to lead me in this direction. They wouldn't say it that way. They'll say, well, this is synchronicity. It's this happy coincidence that's happening to lead me. And so the guy that you're talking about, I listened to him and Richard Dolan. I was listening to a lot of the UFO people when I was writing the book, trying to get a feel for their worldview and what they think. His name is Mike Cleland. And he's got a blog, and he's an abductee, and he's trying to figure this stuff out. And he was talking to Dolan. They were talking about the synchronicity around the number 333, and how the only thing they could find is this is like the time of night that they seem to have all these weird experiences at 3:33 at night. They'll wake up and think they just got back from being abducted, or all kinds of strange things. And Dolan was going, yeah,
Interesting.
the only thing I can find out about that number is that it's half of 666, and there's all these Christians talking about that, and that was kind of strange, right? And then Cleland said that the quote that you started out with, I think he goes, well, I think synchronicity is the language they use to talk to us. Okay, is that was that what it was? I don't have it in front of me, but
Yeah, yeah,
something like that. Okay,
yeah.
well, I thought that was a great quote, right? And I'm like, well, I'm going to use that. So I actually contacted Mike Cleland, the guy that said that, and it turns out that that book was in a book that's been published. I think it's called the Sync Book or the Sync Book 2. I can't remember if it was 1 or 2. But it's in Exo Vatican. I have it footnoted, but it's the Sync Book is actually a compilation of all different people talking about their experiences with synchronicities. So, being someone who's been trained in seminary, I want to footnote everything accurately and get a good source for it. Mike had actually sent me the essay, for free, but I went ahead and bought the book just so I could get the page number and the publisher and document it correctly in Exo Vaticana. So when I bought the book, I found the quote. Guess what page is on? 333.
Don't tell me. 333.
It was, yeah.
No kidding.
I'm not joking.
Holy cow. 333?
Yeah, that was just too weird.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah, it was.
Now that is beyond coincidence. That to me, I mean, they're showing that's showing some. Is there some design in this? I mean,
I don't know, man. That really kind of was chilling.
okay, that is kind of weird. Wow. Okay. You were mentioning about the Vorg earlier, not the Borg, but the Vorg, VORG,
right?
And how the Catholic Church they have a telescope on Mount Graham, and you were talking about this astrobiology. What's going on up there? Is the Catholic leaders looking for ET?
That's what Edgar Mitchell would say. I actually quote, the former astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't have it in front of me. He said, "You want to know about little green men and flying saucers? Ask the Vatican. That's what they're looking for up on top of Mount Graham."
No kidding.
That's what Edgar Mitchell. Yeah, I paraphrased, but that's pretty close to exactly what he said. And so that started like a firestorm of interest. What is going on? Yeah, the Vatican has a state-of-the-art telescope and a whole slew of astronomers with PhDs, and they're up there looking for something. It's really interesting. If you think about history, and especially science, it really did start as an outreach of the church. We had the whole Galileo incident. If you think back, the whole controversy about Copernicanism and is the Earth the center of the system or is it the sun? And the whole thing about the Pope kind of putting Galileo on house arrest, and that kind of gave him a black eye. But there was no such thing as secular science. Science was really, most intellectuals were trained by the church. If you wanted to get an education, in the Middle Ages, you had to be a monk or a priest or something. I mean, there just wasn't any opportunity really for lay people to go to school or to even have books. So most educated people were involved in the religious activities. So that, the birth of science really did come out of the church. And some of the first, observatories and things were sponsored by the church. There was a observatory in the Vatican, in what they called the Tower of Winds, for a long time, and then they moved it into the city of Rome, and then eventually the Jesuits took it over. And I think the Jesuits were really one of the driving forces that tried to convince the office of the papacy that Galileo was actually right, and they went about kind of trying to prove Copernican theory to the church to kind of move them into the modern era. Now, it's really interesting that it's continued. You can see why historically it would be there. It would be that way, but it's been continuous. They've never stopped. In fact, it's developed. Now, what happened out in Arizona? The Jesuits are typically educators, and their whole mission is to go out. To be a Jesuit, you have to have, I think, more than one PhD is one of the requirements. So these guys are highly educated. And a lot of them, some of them aren't even really officially priests. They have what they call a brother Jesuit. Now, some of the astronomers have their degrees in physics and astrophysics and mathematics and science. And they just have kind of a minor in theology, and they would call them a brother. Now, some of them are really full fathers, I guess. So there's different kinds of Jesuits, like ones that you'll see out in the press talking about the observatory and aliens. He talks about wanting to baptize an ET. His name is Brother Guy Cosmonago. So he's a brother. I think all his degrees, most of his advanced degrees are in the sciences. So he's not really trained as a theologian so much. Now, some of the other ones, Jose Funes, he's the leader of the Borg, and he's actually a priest. He's trained as a theologian as well as having a PhD in astronomy or astrophysics or something like that. Now, what's really interesting about Jose Funes, he is the leader of the Borg right now. He's the top man. I found a really interesting connection between the Borg and Petrus Romanus, who would
Chris, hold it right there because we're going to pick that up. And if they're up there with this telescope looking for ETs, and you were saying there was an interesting connection, so just start in where you left off.
Okay, well, yeah, the connection is, if this Malachi prophecy is true, and we're in the reign of the last pope, we're coming up on the end times. One of our speculations is that perhaps this extraterrestrial phenomenon, these UFOs, might have a big part in what we call the end time delusion. If that's sort of what we're looking at, we would expect that maybe, this last pope would have some kind of connection to this ET thing. So then, we noticed that, they have this whole cadre of astronomers up in a state-of-the-art observatory, and they have theologians writing papers about ETs, and we can talk about that a little bit more later. But so, what about this Pope? He was Bergoglio, right? He's from Argentina. Well, it turns out that when he was a young man, he started out wanting to be a scientist. He got a master's degree in chemistry before he went to seminary. So, interestingly, the leader of the Borg, Jose Funes, guess where he's from? Argentina.
Oh.
Now, this all happened before the Pope came into office, that Funes was made the leader of the Borg. But as to the Jesuit who brought Jose Funes into the Jesuit order, Bergoglio, the first Jesuit pope. He's the first Jesuit pope. He's also the Jesuit that sponsored Jose Funes into the Jesuit order in Argentina. So they have a very intimate connection. They're very close. So the leader of the Borg is like this with the Pope kind of thing. And it's the first Jesuit Pope in history, which a lot of people see a lot of significance in them. Because there's all the Jesuit order. But without even going into the more tinfoil hat versions of those, we have a Jesuit, Malachi Martin, Father Martin, who left the Jesuit order to write books about corruption. Advisor to three popes, very serious guy, exorcist. A lot of people are familiar with Malachi. He was on Coast to Coast a lot, but he claimed
I remember him.
Yeah, he claimed that there was a cadre of Satanists, Satan worshipers, who had infiltrated the Jesuit order, that they had done a ritual in 1963 to transform the office of the papacy into an instrument of the devil. And so that would be seeing its fruition in the false prophet. That's kind of one of the angles that we went at in Petrus Romanus. So, but Malachi Martin also wrote about the Vatican Observatory. He was on Coast to Coast with Art Bell in 1997. And Art Bell asked him what they were doing up there, because that thing went online, I think, in 1993. And,
really? It's been up there that long?
It's been up there that long, yeah. And Malachi Martin, when he asked him that, here's his answer. I have it right in front of me. He says, because the mentality among those who are at the highest levels of the Vatican administration and geopolitics know that what's going on in space and what's approaching us could be of great import. And so he literally
Okay.
gives you the impression that they're like waiting for something to show up.
So
And
they're up there looking for something, and
that's
they're
what he
waiting
said.
for something. I
Yeah.
mean, this goes back to Malachi Martin making this statement
Yeah. And,
back
and,
in the
it-
early 90s.
and he said this in like 97, and he said like in the next decade or so, right? But I mean, so that it would be like overdue at this point. But I mean, what have we seen happen since then? Well, one of the things I talk about in the book, I briefly mentioned the science of astrobiology. It's the marriage of astronomy and biology, the study of space, the study of life. They're looking for life in space. I kind of like to make jokes about it because you can go out and get a PhD in a discipline that technically has nothing to study. Think about that. We don't really know about any life in space, right? So
Right?
you can get a PhD in a science that has no subjects.
Really? Wow.
Isn't that weird? I mean, but they're looking for potential life, right? So they're looking for the possibility of it, but they really haven't found any. So technically, it is a science with nothing to study. Um, but so the Vatican had an astrobiology study week in 2009, all right, and in Rome, sponsored by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. They invited the top people in the field to Rome to have a discussion. This was, like over 10 days. It was at the Pope's summer residence, Castello Gandolfo, where his meteorite collection resides as well. And they invited atheists and people with all varying worldviews. They weren't Catholics. These were the top scientists. And now they did this in 2009, and the keynote speaker was a guy from University of Arizona. He's the head of the astrobiology department there. His name's Dr. Chris Impey. I think he's a very esteemed scientist and astrobiologist, an astronomer. Now, what he said in the keynote address is that, right now we don't know certain of any life in space, but we expect to make an announcement in a few short years. Okay. And
What?
that was in 2009. Okay. Now, what was he talking about? Well, I think the main thing that he was referring to is the Kepler space satellite has been finding hundreds of what they call exoplanets. And this is kind of where we got the name Exo Vaticana. Exo just kind of means outside of. And, in 1996, I think it was, we had not found a single planet outside of our own solar system. We did not know of any other planets, and they were all just kind of a guess. But since then, I think right now we're up above 700 that they've found. And I'll explain a little bit about how they find them, because it's not quite as impressive as it sounds at first once you understand it. Let me see what we got. If I just Google exoplanets, they just found one day ago. I mean, they pop
Wow.
up. They
And
find them all the time. No, but let me tell you how they find them.
okay.
So the Kepler space satellite, what it does is it'll zero in on a star, way off. And what it looks at is the star will blink or wobble. If it blinked significantly, that means something is orbiting it. And so when it passes in front of the star, you see it dims the light. Okay. So that's what they're looking at. If they see a star blinking at a certain rate, they know it's being orbited by something large. Or they can sort of estimate the size of it by how much of the light that it takes away. And if it wobbles, that shows that something very massive is orbiting around it, which will actually create a wobble as it rotates. And the Earth actually makes the sun wobble just a little bit, but you can detect that with really precision instruments. So what the Kepler space satellite is doing is just measuring blinking and wobbling, and then guessing. That it has to be a massive object of this size to create this much dispersion of light or this much wobble. That's the main way that it works. They don't even really see the planet. They're just detecting it. What they do is once they detect it, they'll go and they'll look for it, and they'll do some other tests to verify that there's really a planet there. And they're reasonably sure that there is. Some of them they've actually photographed, but very few of them. Now, the one thing that you'll hear, and I think it's a misnomer, I think it's very misleading, and it's kind of a product of the naturalistic atheistic world that astrobiology is born out of, is that they'll say that they found an Earth-like exoplanet, and everybody gets all
Oh,
excited.
sure. Yeah, I've
Yeah,
heard that before.
right, and everybody gets really excited. Oh, it's Earth-like. That means it has life. Now, I want to back up just a little bit to address a worldview issue, because this was part of the presentation I do when I go and talk about this book, and and the belief in ETs. Now, a lot of people would say, is this consistent with a Christian worldview? And I say, the Bible and Christianity is really rather silent on the issue of whether ETs exist. But this whole science and this project that we're looking at is very antagonistic to the Christian worldview for this reason. The presuppositions that drive them to make these statements that the universe is teeming with life. They'll say this a lot. Now, what their whole rationale for that is that Copernicus proved that the Earth is not the center of the universe. All right, he said the sun is the center of our solar system. Well, from that, astronomers extrapolated another principle, and they call it the Copernican principle. That means that they're saying the Earth not only is it not the center, it's not even a special type of planet. It's just a normal, regular, old run-of-the-mill planet amongst many that are probably like it. Okay, and then from there, they extrapolate it a little further, and now they have something, and they teach this at universities. They call it the principle of mediocrity. So now the Earth is just a mediocre planet, okay? And that includes everything on the Earth. So, humans are just evolved primates, and there's really nothing special about us either, or life, or anything. It's just all mediocre. And that means there's probably millions more just like it somewhere out there in this vastness of the universe. And this is a worldview thing. They don't have any idea that God specially created us, or that any of this is very important. We're just an accident of matter and energy reckoned into each other in certain combinations. This is the whole worldview issue. So, for them, it comes naturally from their worldview that we're mediocre. There's nothing special about here, so there's no reason why it didn't happen a million more times. Okay,
Yeah.
and so this is why belief in aliens and belief in a universe teeming with life really is antagonistic to a Christian worldview, because the presuppositions that drive those conclusions are very anti-biblical, and they really are anti-God.
Well, they all have a common theme, and a common message seems to be very pantheistic, very evolutionary. As you're saying, I noticed this paradigm shift to the belief in what we're talking about as cosmic evolution or universal evolution now, that it has to be true not just on Earth but everywhere. Mm-hmm. If evolution is true, and you're saying, hey, this isn't anything special, life on Earth isn't anything special, so if they're finding these exoplanets, life should be on these other planets. Evolution should be in progress there, so why not have life on other planets? And that may help explain this UFO phenomenon and the ETs and all this, and that's the tide, that's the message. But what other message are they proclaiming, Chris? Is there another message that maybe they're here to help us and help benefit mankind somehow?
Well, extending from that, they look at how old they believe the universe is, and I don't know how old it is, but I don't really have a problem with the age so much. But what they'll say is that because it is so old, the chances are that we're, relatively a young species. So these other aliens are probably, a million years ahead of us. So of course they're superior. Look how much we've achieved in the last 100 years. Now imagine us, if we were to continue at the same rate without killing everybody, where we'd be in a million years. And then you start getting into Star Trek and Star Wars and all these visions of the future, and where we have all this really advanced stuff. And you can sort
through
of
the wormhole.
Yeah, you could think that maybe that's possible. So then, you get these ideas of these really superior aliens, right? And this is where what I call the alien savior mythos has come from. And if you're a secular person, it kind of follows, and it kind of is a hope that you might have. And it's really kind of popular in the UFO community to think that in 1947, right when we developed and dropped the nuclear bomb, that the flying saucers showed up to keep us from killing each other. Okay, and they, if you look at even the hearings that they had in D.C. last year, the disclosure hearings, they had a lot of
Oh,
they had a lot of people testifying about flying saucers shutting down nuclear facilities.
I
And
heard about that. I
right.
talked to someone recently about that. That was
Hmm.
at that hearing, and look, there was people in our government who readily admitted
Did it happen?
to these things, and
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it just confirmed that, yeah, this, I mean, this is something that we can no longer ignore.
Well, yeah, there are military officials who said that, yeah, a flying saucer flew down and it shut down all the computers in the nuclear silos. It literally shut them down. So this kind of
Extraordinary.
this kind of it really does reinforce the idea that maybe they're monitoring us to protect us from ourselves. Okay, that's what I'm getting at, and I think they're really trying to push that idea. They want us to think that they're kind of the cosmic police.
Well,
That
and we see that message that we were talking about earlier about Whitley Strieber, who initially said they were demonic, they were evil, they were malevolent, they did things against his will. It was it was a terrifying experience for him. And then as these things continued, then he changes course and he says, you know what, they're actually here to give me messages for the world, and they're here to help us. And he has kind of parroted that same message. Now they're here to help us. But what are they here to help us for? Is it to help us from destroying ourselves? Is it to prevent nuclear war? Maybe World War III? Maybe that's why they're all over the nuclear plants. Is it here? Are they here to usher in our next stage of evolution?
right.
And that's what I address in my book. And look, that's what kind of grabbed me. I was talking to you earlier about what initially grabbed you on this thing. That's the point that grabbed me, is when I saw this paradigm shift. They're here to help us with the next stage of evolution, and it's not a physical one, it's going to be a spiritual one. But there's all these kind of common messages. They're here to help us, to save us from ourselves. We see this in some of the movie themes, Transformers, etc. We see that they got a common message for mankind. They're here to advance us to our next stage of evolution, but they're so deceptive about the thing. And these accounts of people's abductees accounts are never good. None of them are ever good. And you have to question. You have to think, what is the real message? What's going on here? And the only thing that I see, Chris, is deception.
Well, I would agree with that. And the person that is my go-to guy to make this argument is Jacques Vallée, because Jacques Vallée is not a Christian by any means. He is a very secular type researcher. He has a PhD in computer science and a master's degree in astronomy. He's been studying UFOs. He was on Project Blue Book with J. Allen Hynek. So you really can't find anybody who's more qualified, who's been doing it longer than Jacques Vallée. He's eminently qualified. He's a scientist. He's been studying it for a long time. He's not a Christian. He doesn't have our worldview. He probably has more of an occultic type worldview. But, I think he's a good scientist. Now, what's interesting to me is that his conclusions are remarkably similar to ours. He wrote a book called Messengers of Deception, okay, where he's noticed that these things lie, no matter when they don't even need to, they lie to people. And what Vallée has a hypothesis called the control grid.
Really? What's this about?
He believes that the whole purpose of UFOs and most of the sightings, it's almost nonsensical in that it's not really what it appears to be, but it's a manipulation designed to steer the worldviews of different cultures. Like he would classify the Fatima thing as one of these, it's almost like a false flag event where it's something that it's being done with an agenda that's under the surface.
Hey, Chris, I lost you on that last part. Can you repeat your last statement?
Yeah, he's saying that, it's not what it appears to be necessarily, but it's really some kind of a psychological manipulation meant to influence the worldviews of the people that see it. Now, he calls this meta logic. And meta is kind of a prefix that means beyond or something like that. So he's talking about a kind of a paradoxical logic. And it's kind of like the sort of thing you hear in Buddhism where they say, meditate on the sound of one hand clapping, right? In fact, I think, yeah, it's something like that, something that's preposterous. And what it's designed to do is break down your ordinary way of thinking. And it's like an absurd kind of absurdity, but the idea is that it's manipulating your consciousness somehow. So this is what Vallée thinks, that the ETs and the contactee messages, that it promotes absurd things on purpose that are meant to confuse you, and they do it intentionally, like the sound of one hand clapping, which is just an absurdity, but all these Buddhists think it's this really deep thing, and they sit there and meditate on it. This is the same sort of thing that the UFOs are doing it. Now, why are they doing that? Well, Vallée thinks that it's so they can sort of fly under the radar of the officials, like the NASA scientists and all the physicists. Most of them think that UFOs are just a bunch of delusions that these freaks are having. There's nothing real about it. It's because it has all these absurd things attached to it that nobody really believes. So that the real hardcore naturalistic scientists ignore it because they think it's nonsense. And then all your really kind of freaky new agers, they all just buy right into it and they love the nonsense. So, it's something that it disturbs and it reassures at the same time. It exploits the gullibility of the people that want to believe in it, and then it exploits the narrow-mindedness of the people that want to debunk it. And that way, nobody really takes it seriously enough to figure out what's going on. And so do you understand that? Does that make sense?
But yeah, absolutely. Until there's disclosure,
right?
Until there's a moment of disclosure that is undeniable. And Chris, do you think that day's coming where there's going to be a moment or a time in the future history that there's going to be a moment of disclosure that will be undeniable?
Well, a lot of people have commented on the Vatican's role in that. Richard Dolan did participate in a book that they called, what was it called? After Disclosure was the title of the book. And in that book, there's a couple paragraphs where he said, many people have recognized that the world's largest church has placed itself, right as a central player in this discussion. So he made an extensive little commentary about how the Catholic Church has really manipulated things to put itself as really the go-to religious authority when this happens.
Yeah, and I even heard that the Pope said, "Hey, if there's ETs and this disclosure's made, we would baptize them."
Yeah, there's several of them have done that. Several of the people we were talking about, the Vorg, Jose Funes, Guy Cosmonago, several of them have given interviews. In fact, you could just Google "baptized extraterrestrial" and you'll get a whole slew of articles. Of them will be interviewing these Vorg astronomers that I'm talking about, who seem to be tongue-in-cheek joking about it, but some of it is, you can sort of see under the surface if they're not joking. In Rome, I think in 2009, 2010, Jose Funes authored an official paper called The Extraterrestrial Savior. The Pope came out and said that it was, that Catholics should believe in extraterrestrials, that it wasn't against anything in Catholic theology.
Now, Chris, you said that the name of that, you broke up just a little bit again. The name of the paper was
The Extraterrestrial is My Brother by Jose Funes. And it's at the Vatican website, written in Italian, but I think there's a translation of it online. Now, there's been several theological positions espoused. There's a guy at Notre Dame, a Catholic theologian, Tanzanitsi. He has written that, of course, they will probably be superior to us, so we're going to have to modify our theology according to the new data that we get from them. So rather than us evangelizing them, they'll be evangelizing us. And we're
really,
yeah. So that's pretty astounding coming from the Catholic Church, who has always sort of asserted itself as the ultimate religious authority, that you would have to be in submission to them to even be saved. Now saying that they're going to modify their beliefs according to the new information they're going to get from these benevolent space brothers who are so far superior. And this is coming from high-level theologians at Notre Dame and in Rome, and it's not just some fringe element. This is actually well within the acceptable intellectual community of Roman Catholicism.
Unbelievable. Now, Chris, how does it sounds like they're on the verge of wanting full disclosure, and they're public about it, and they're willing to help initiate this process. It sounds like with this telescope on Mount Graham. Understand that the name of that telescope is they've named it Lucifer, which is very odd.
Well, that might need a little clarifying, but
well, sure, go ahead.
Well, actually, the Lucifer device is not on the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. It's on the Large Binocular Telescope, and that it's about 100 yards up the road. Now, I think it was probably named by the Max Planck Institute in Germany. So I don't know that we should put that one on the Jesuits. In fact, at first I thought that maybe that the secular guys were having a stab at them by naming it Lucifer. But it turns out that in Germany, there's a politician. See, the Large Binocular Telescope, this is the most powerful telescope in the world. They say that it gets better images than the Hubble Space Telescope. That's how
on
powerful.
Mount Graham
On
in
Mount
Arizona.
Graham. Yeah, and it's right next to the Vatican building. This is the premier telescope in the world, period. Okay, it's called the Large Binocular Telescope. It's got huge mirrors. That's why it's so powerful. It's got two of them. Now, the Lucifer device is an infrared camera. It stands for Large Binocular Telescope, Spectroscopic Utility with Integral Field Unit, and Camera for Extragalactic Research. It's an acronym. That's what it actually spells out. And so you can tell that someone really forced all that language to fit under those letters, the LUCIF. It hardly makes any sense, but it's really this long title for an infrared camera that they use to look for exoplanets and for signs of life. So what it is, it gathers infrared spectrum light from the mirror, and it just brings it to a computer to analyze it. So Lucifer is an infrared camera, and they do use it in the search for life in space. It is an integral piece of equipment. And there's actually two of them now. They have what they call Lucy 2. They kind of call it Lucy for short. Now, so this Large Binocular Telescope, it's like a $36 million piece of hardware. And because it's so expensive and massive, it's not really owned by any one organization. It's a consortium. You have major U.S. universities that are part of it. You have major universities in Italy that are part of it. You have major constituents from Germany, the Max Planck Institute, which has 3 or 4 different places. So you have all these major research universities. You have Rome, Italy, United States. And, of course, the Vatican does have a guy in there. They just graduated a Jesuit about 2 or 3 years ago whose specialty is astrobiology and the look for exoplanets. And when we interviewed some of these Jesuits when we wrote the book, he was just getting started over there in the LBT facility. So they do have their point man in that project. Now, if you go on the website, it'll say that their mission statement says that their mission is to search for Earth-like planets.
It blows my mind. It really does. And Chris, you and Tom got a chance to go visit that satellite in Arizona.
Yeah, we absolutely did. Yeah, we spent a day up there touring the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, and then right next to that is the Heinrich Hertz radio telescope, the sub-millimeter radio telescope with a big dish. It's probably only like literally 40 yards from the Vatican's facility. Then there's a little dirt road, and there's a video you can see us walking around out there, and the Large Binocular Telescope's right up the road, and yeah, it's the most powerful telescope in the world. And
did you get to look through that? I mean, what did you think when you went there?
It's impressive. I mean, it's way up on top of this mountain. They call it a rainforest ecosystem up there because, I mean, the Indians really had a hard time with them even building up there. The whole thing was very controversial. They kind of bypassed the Forestry Service and went around it to get the whole thing built. Some people think the Pope actually put some pressure on Catholic congressmen to get the thing built. And I talk about some of that controversy in chapter 2 of the book, the Sky Island ecosystem. And the thing that's really unusual, though, if you start looking into the lore, the Indians have some really interesting legends about that mountain and that top up there where they're at. It's called Emerald Point. People have been seeing UFOs up there for years.
Chris, it broke up again. Tell us, what was it called?
People have been seeing UFOs up on Emerald Point for years.
And what did the Indians call that?
Well, I mean, the Indians have different names for them, but you know, we put some of the legends in the book, and there's even stories of giants that used to be in that area. So it's all very strange that they've chose that location. You know, actually, the highway that goes up that mountain, it's Highway 666.
What?
Yeah, I think they changed the name of it.
Oh, they did. You know, it did. I've got, you know, there was a friend of mine who lives in Arizona. He said their highway used to be called 666, so they changed it to another number now because people were tripping out. And I understand there's stories from truckers and Chris's new book, Exo Vaticana. Chris, when we were talking about, you know, the possibility, the ramifications of what all this means, I know the Catholic Church is poised to accept this, but what about your Christian beliefs? Are you, is it possible to accommodate ETs from other planets in your worldview?
Well, here's how I approach that question. I read a lot of books, you know, preparing to write this book, Exo Vaticana. And, you know, one thing that I try to do is to be intellectually honest. And that means I want to understand the other side. I want to understand what they believe, and I want to represent what they believe fairly. Because, you know, as someone who functions as an apologist, as a Christian apologist, one of the things that annoys me the most is when I get into some debate with an atheist and he represents everything I say and twists it, and, you know, says, oh, you believe in a talking snake, and, you know, they just kind of make fun of everything, and they don't really understand where you're coming from or what you actually believe. So what they're actually attacking has nothing to do, you know, with what you're actually trying to defend, and it just becomes, you know, a mess. So I don't want to do that to the people that I disagree with. I want to try to represent their beliefs as fairly as I can. So I want to try to understand where they're coming from.
Sure.
Now, so to do that, you know, you have to kind of read their books and try to find out who, you know, their intellectuals are and who they respect. And so, you know, some of the people that I read Christians that actually believe in aliens, and there are plenty, and some of them are what I would call on the theologically liberal side, but, you know, some of them aren't. One of them is Ted Peters. He's a Lutheran, and he's written some books about UFOs, and he's actually fairly well known in the UFO circles. Ted Peters, Dr. Ted Peters. Now, you know, one of his criticisms of what he calls the fundamentalist position that this is demonic is that, you know, we kind of operate from an argument from silence. And the way he critiques that is he says, you know, they'll say that, well, the Bible doesn't mention extraterrestrials, therefore extraterrestrials don't exist. Now, you know, if you know anything about logic and arguments, that's kind of a fallacious argument.
Yeah, it really is.
So, you know, and you do hear Christians that make that argument. Well, the Bible doesn't say it, so it's not there. It doesn't exist. Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about toilet paper. And,
right.
And I'm pretty sure it exists, and I'm glad we have it.
Right.
So, you know, it's not a good argument. Now, so I wanted to be careful not to use that kind of reasoning. So what I developed, and you'll find it in Exo Vaticana, is what I call the philosophy of history argument, from the biblical philosophy of history. Now, and here's how it goes. I sort of parse it this way. The Bible is silent about the existence of ETs, and God is certainly powerful enough to have other beings on other planets. I don't put that past his sovereignty and his ability. He's infinite. He could have, as many as he wants, and he doesn't have to tell me about it. He doesn't owe me that explanation. So, sure, it's possible. I have to allow for that possibility. But God did give us a revelation in the New Testament about him and about our salvation and about what we're supposed to be doing here on earth as we wait for Jesus to return. And that is really the big event that we're supposed to be hoping for and watching for, is for Christ to return and set up the kingdom of God on earth. Now, that is the big paradigm shift that God told us to expect, and that's what we're supposed to be watching for. I do not see anything about benevolent aliens coming to help me in my cosmic evolution. That is not there. But there is a lot about a great deception that happens right before the thing that I am supposed to be waiting for, before Jesus returns. There's supposed to be a great deception that would lead astray even the elect, if that were possible.
Right.
Now, when I look at the sorts of things that I see characteristic of the UFO phenomenon, what do I see? I see deception. I see misleading. I see people, them trying to undermine the Christian worldview. I see them trying to undermine the idea of sin and atonement. So, when I look at what the Bible does say, okay, I don't have to worry about what it doesn't say. But what it does say, it seems to have this problem neatly categorized right under that deceptive entity that happens right before Jesus returns. So it's not an argument from silence. There's a philosophy of history that says, I'm supposed to be watching for this sequence of events and Bible prophecy. And I think, to my mind, biblical prophecy is a proven entity when I look at the predictions about Jesus, the predictions of the destruction of Rome, of Jerusalem. I mean, there's all these fulfilled prophecies throughout the Bible. And so I have really good reason to believe the ones that Jesus made about the time of his return. So, and if I'm going to categorize this phenomenon that I see going on in our culture, the alien abductions, the flying saucers, the contactees, it's all falls right under the category of the deceptive, and it's all there.
I have a friend who's a mathematician, and I asked him, I said, give it to me in terms of math, probabilities, about all these prophecies in the Bible that have come true historically, things that we can verify empirically, historically, verify, even in archaeology and other fields of science. That, what's the probability of these things coming to pass? Israel becoming a nation, the prophecies of the Messiah, the prophecies of the end times that's not yet occurred that will be future history, that you're talking about, eschatology or Bible prophecy. He said it's so precise, sometimes it's down to the day, that it's mathematically, humanly impossible, to the point where it just cannot happen. We're not talking Nostradamus, who was hit and miss and who maybe had part of it right and then part of it wrong. We're not talking about that. We're talking about prophecy that's 100% accurate, that can be historically verified. And you were talking about Bible prophecy, Chris. Do you think that, there's an alien invasion coming in the end times? A lot of people believe that we're racing towards the end times. Mm-hmm. This is all coming up to one event. Even Art Bell used to say, back in the days when I used to listen to Art and really became a fan of radio, was, he termed it the quickening. And we have people in the in the Christian theology side, eschatology side, that would say we're racing towards the end times or the last days, and the battle of Armageddon, and the one world government and the one world religious system, and all this is coming about. Is there a tie to this in biblical prophecy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is. And like I said the Bible has a lot about a strong delusion, about false signs and wonders, false prophets that lead people astray. And I think this phenomenon plays a big part in it. Now, I want to be careful I don't know if flying saucers have anything to do with the end times, but I suspect they do. And I think I have good reasons to suspect that. Mainly the sorts of things that we've been talking about with how these things are deceptive and how they tried to lead people to believe things that are false. Now, also, I look at, being a Christian, our worldview tells us that there's a deceptive world system that's out there trying to lead people away from the truth. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says the God of this world blinds the minds of unbelievers so they can't see the truth of the gospel. And it's talking about the devil. Okay, Ephesians chapter 6 says, we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, against spiritual wickedness in high heavenly places. The devil is the prince of the power of the air. So, I believe that there is a cosmic conspiracy to lead people astray, to lead people away from the truth that is in Jesus Christ. And, so in believing that, it's not hard at all to look at all the money that Hollywood has invested in aliens and promoting belief in ETs since the 40s. All the movies about ETs, all the documentaries about UFOs and flying saucers and ETs. There's just been a ton of resources poured into this subject. It's really hard to believe that they're not going to use that. Okay, so that's just a pure speculation. I don't claim to have any supernatural knowledge, but you just look at what the world believes. Now, if you look at how caustic it is to biblical faith, because to believe in this, you have to start accepting these presuppositions, like the principle of mediocrity and the fact that we just all evolved from pond scum and that it happens everywhere in the universe, and the universe is teeming with life, and there's nothing special about us, so there's probably not a God, and blah, 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 blah. You can see how it all fits together, supports this naturalistic view of the world, this pantheistic monism kind of idea that's really popular. Now, we've barely scratched the surface, because there's a Catholic theologian named Teilhard Chardin who was popular in the early 20th century, and he really wrote about this cosmic evolution thing that's remarkably, I think he was probably the father of the New Age. He was considered a heretic back when he was writing, but even the popes have endorsed his theology in the last couple decades, and he intimately believed in aliens. So really, at the end of the book Exo Vaticana, I kind of break down his whole cosmic evolution system and explain how this might all work together to promote the rise of the Antichrist. Now, my argument on that, I'll give it to you really simple, is that
Sure.
the Bible tells us that there's going to be a world leader, and that the world is going to believe his claim to be God. Now, it's in 2 Thessalonians, it's in Daniel. Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation. I believe that is when he goes into the temple and claims to be God. And, why would anybody believe that? Well, why are atheists going to believe that? Why are, New Agers going to believe that? Why are Buddhists going to believe that? You have all these different worldviews. What's going to capture the world's attention and make them follow this one guy? Well, when I do my talk, on my PowerPoint, I have this little clip of Ronald Reagan speaking at the United Nations. And Ronald Reagan says, how quickly our differences would just collapse if we were faced with an alien threat from outside of this world. That was one of his favorite lines to say.
How true. How true.
And so, that's what I'm getting at. For something to capture the world's imagination and make everybody follow under the power of one world leader, something's going to transcendent of the world's going to have to do that. Now, what phenomenon, what category better fits that than something coming from outer space? And people are already believing in it. In the UK, there was a survey in 2012. More people believe in ET than God. Okay? People already believe it. They already believe it. So if the devil's going to pull off a massive deception, it seems to me that this is already in place. I mean,
And we're here to help you, save you from yourselves. We're here to lead you to your next stage of spiritual evolution. We're talking to Chris Putnam on his new book, Exo Vaticana. Be sure you go to his website, logosapologia.org, logosapologia.org, or to the Facebook site, which is Alien Savior, facebook.com, Alien Savior, which is the Exo Vaticana Facebook page. Chris, I understand you got a new book coming out in March. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, I got into all this. Basically, I went and got a master's degree in theology, and I really started out, doing Christian apologetics, arguments for the resurrection, the existence of God, the existence of moral values, consciousness, all these kind of things. Defending the Christian faith is kind of where I'm grounded. And but the supernatural worldview is a book it kind of starts with an apologetic angle, and we kind of define worldview and some of these terms like naturalism and metaphysics and things like that. But really, the angle of the book is making an argument that the paranormal is increasingly becoming the new normal. I think that paradigm shift is already underway.
Oh, you're right, Chris, because look, I just heard on mainstream national reporting from the networks about a couple of years back now, but apparently a young boy was apparently demon possessed and was witnessed not only by his family members, but by the medical professionals at the hospital and the social worker, and he walks up the wall backwards.
Yeah, I heard about that.
And you're like, what in the world? That the new norm is not normal anymore. You're absolutely right.
The paranormal is the new normal. Now, the thing that I'm concerned about, are Christians ready to handle this? And to get into this subject, I really did some kind of off the wall things. I actually went and studied parapsychology at the Rhine Institute, which is what is left of the Duke parapsychology lab of J.B. Rhine in the early 20th century. One of the guys that I read is a Chinese Christian author named Watchman Nee. Now, he was around in the early 20th century as well, and he actually died in the 1950s in a communist prison. He died for his faith as a martyr. But Watchman Nee wrote a book in 1932 called The Latent Power of the Soul. And in that book, he predicted that just before the end times and the tribulation, that Satan would really try to get people to develop psychic powers and ESP, that he was really going to make a play to get into the souls of a lot of people by promoting Eastern spirituality and psychic things. Now, I see that just happening in spades. Like you mentioned Oprah Winfrey, Deepak Chopra. People are so into Eastern meditation. You have Christians doing yoga now, and yoga is a Hindu religious practice that is meant to open you up to Hinduism. It really is. It's meant to open you up to the Hindu gods.
Wow.
And you have Christians doing it like it's some kind of stretching exercise, but it's really intimately tied to Hinduism, and like the mantras that they chant and the things that they say are actually worshiping Hindu gods. And some people don't even know what they're saying. But we see this happening in spades. The worldview in America right now is what we call oneism, or pantheistic monism. It's the same sort of metaphysical idea that you see in Hinduism and Buddhism. All is one, or everybody is God. You had, Shirley MacLaine saying this in the 80s, I'm God, we're all part of God. And in pluralism, that all religions are really saying the same thing. We just have to coexist. These ideas have inundated the culture. You probably have over half of Americans that have bought into it. Even liberal Christianity has bought into it. You have the emergent church. You have Brian McLaren saying, we don't need to convert Buddhists to become Christians. We need to make Buddhist followers of Jesus. Now, that's so incoherent, it's ridiculous, because most of Buddhism is atheistic. So how do you have an atheist follower of Jesus? I mean, it doesn't even make sense. But this idea that all is one and that all is becoming one, it fits hand in glove with Pierre Chardin, who I quote in Extra Vaticana. And it's the same message that you hear from the contactees and from the ETs and the abductees. It's the same message that the aliens are promoting, this monistic oneism, that all is one and all is becoming one. And that is really the dominant idea. So I really tackle that in the supernatural worldview. So what is the supernatural worldview? Well, the supernatural means there's something more than natural, okay? Now, in Romans 1:25, Paul says that, people were given over because they worship the creation over the creator, okay? And what Paul is saying, if you look at that verse in Romans chapter 1, is there's really only two categories of religion. You either worship the creation or you worship the creator. Worship the creation, that's oneism. That's what I'm talking about. All is one. Everything's contained within nature. That's atheistic naturalism fits in there too. It's all matter and energy. Everything is one. But it's amazing to me that New Age philosophy and atheism fit together, but they're saying the same thing. The worship the creator, okay? We have something outside of nature. This is twoism. All right. This is supernatural, something more than natural. The supernatural worldview is that there is something more than nature. So we have this idea of a divine creator, and it's not all one, okay? There's something outside of the one. And so that's really what I'm talking about. And it really is the Christian worldview. But in dealing with that, I'm going to handle all the kinds of paranormal phenomenon in that book, ESP, psychokinesis. I talk about premonitions and prophecies from secular and biblical points of view, and I compare them. And I think that there are strange abilities that some humans have that others don't. We can recognize that they exist, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily a good thing that you want to develop.
Yeah.
I also talk about spiritual warfare and demons and Satan, and we kind of wrap it all together and how this fits into a worldview. So it's really kind of a comprehensive apologetics approach for the end times. It really my goal is to prepare Christians for all the weird stuff that's about to break loose.
There is weird stuff, Chris, that's happening now. I just talked about that report that came out from the national media about this recent demon possession of this young boy. He walked up the wall backwards.
Right.
I mean, come on. There is things happening. What do you think about some of these magicians, Chris Angel and David Blaine? I've watched a few of those guys, and some of them you think, okay, that's a trick, and then they show you how they do it, and you're like, okay, and then some of it you're like, okay, maybe that's not a trick.
Yeah, you have to wonder. I mean, I don't know. But
I don't know either. But
Chris Angel certainly promotes the idea that there's something more going on, and a lot of people believe that about him. Now, I can't say that it's true, but I know I've actually got in discussions with people with an occult worldview that absolutely believe that he has entities that help him. There's David Blaine has. He's not really accepted by mainstream magicians. They've kind of ousted him. Because of the same, I think, kind of principle with him. People are scared, but you're talking about this is something that humans are doing. Right.
That's supernatural. It's beyond and above the naturalistic means or explanation, but yet we got people, maybe or maybe not Chris Angel or David Blaine. Some people say yes, some people say no, but listen, there's people that are tapping into a source, and you're saying in this new book coming out in March that source may not necessarily be one for our good.
Yeah, absolutely not. Now, I think there's all kinds of weird things that happen. I mean, the Bible is full of paranormal phenomenon. I mean, we have floating axe heads. We have fiery chariots flying down from heaven and taking Elijah into the sky. It's not all necessarily evil. Some of it is and some of it isn't. And, we're told by John that we're to test the spirits. What does that mean?
Absolutely.
But that assumes that you believe that spirits exist, right? You can't test them if they don't exist. The thing that concerns me is that in the West, in the United States, many Christians have kind of assumed a naturalistic sort of worldview. They're not prepared for this. They assume that miracles don't really happen. And most of us are very comfortable with a scientific kind of take on life. And that will get you really far in a lot of ways. And it's been very successful in developing our technology, and it makes our lives really convenient. But when weird paranormal stuff starts breaking out all around, are these people prepared to handle it? I don't think they are. I think that we've had a lot of demythologizing going on, in our understanding of Scripture even, and a lot of people just aren't really prepared for it. So that's what the supernatural worldview is trying to address. It's saying, how do you answer these questions about what is real? and what isn't, and what's possible and what's not. And what does the Bible say about that? What's consistent with the biblical revelation? What did Jesus believe? Jesus went around healing people, but do you know that over half of those healings were actually exorcisms? And they're, in the sense that he cast demons out of people, and that was what was causing their disease. We don't think that way. We see somebody that's sick, we tell them to go to the doctor. It doesn't even occur to me that it might be a demon doing it.
Right.
So I don't know that we have the worldview that Jesus had. So this book is sort of a step in that direction, and I'm trying to offer some evidence and arguments that might move people to have a more supernatural worldview.
Chris, give us the name of your website, the name of the upcoming book, and how people can contact you.
Certainly. So my website is logosapologia.org. Now, that comes from two words. There's a Greek word logos, which means word. So in the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Logos. So it's Logos. Apologia is a Greek word that means defense. It's where the word apologetics comes from. So when Peter writes, always be ready to give a defense of the hope that was within you, he's saying always ready to be the apologia. So it's Logosapologia, logosapologia.org. That's my main website. The book that's coming out March 28th is called The Supernatural Worldview. There's a Facebook page, facebook.com, Supernatural Worldview. Tom Horn will be the publisher of that. It'll be available. I'm going to premiere it at the Prophecy in the News Orlando conference on March 28th. That's when it'll come out. And then hopefully we'll have it in Amazon and all the outlets by April. Exo-Vaticana is the book we were mainly discussing today. You can find that at exovaticana.com. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's at Amazon.com. And Raiders News Network is my publisher's website. Raiders News Network, that's Tom Horn's site. But we also have a Facebook page for that one. That one is facebook.com Alien Savior. And I put a lot of UFO reports and things up on that site. So if you follow me on Facebook, you'll kind of keep up with what's going on in these subjects.
Chris, thanks for being on the show. We really appreciate it. Time flies by, and let me tell you, this has been a great show. Thank you so much, Chris, for being on.
It was my pleasure, Aaron.
Remember, in a time of